Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, a shot in the arm for Japan. Can this man, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, revitalise the Japanese economy? We look at what they're calling Abenomics, as hope gives way to volatility. Also this week, billions go missing and India's poorest lose everything. We look at corruption, suicide and politics as Ponzi schemes in West Bengal collapse. Plus the $4 billion plan to revitalise the Palestinian economy, to create jobs and new homes. But will John Kerry's plan work where many others have failed? Hello everyone. It's rare for the leader of a nation to have a set of economic policies named after him. But Shinzo Abe is just one rare example. A man with a plan to fire up Japan's economy, which has come to be known as Abenomics. Japan desperately needed to end almost 2 decades of deflation, weak domestic demand, and another recession late last year. So Shinzo Abe produced what he calls 3 arrows to take on the challenge: fiscal, structural, and monetary. This is how it's played out so far. A commitment of around $117 billion to infrastructure, health, and education. An inflation target set at 2% by the Bank of Japan. And also in the footsteps of the US Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, money printing, or quantitative easing as they officially call it, a massive $1.4 trillion program to flood the markets with money. Now, all said and done, that'll actually increase Japan's debt, remembering it's already the most indebted nation in the world, with levels of 230% of GDP. So is this the right track? We'll examine that in a moment. First, a practical lesson in Abenomics from Harry Fawcett in Tokyo.
At Kozo Sushi, they're hoping that the good times continue to roll. They're serving up their own response to Abenomics, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's stimulus spending, money printing, currency weakening bet to improve the economy. The stock market has rocketed by more than a third this year. Prices are rising too, but wages have been static. So here they hand out their own dividend, an extra bit of fish every day the Nikkei index closes up. Compliments of the chef.
To be honest, ordinary people like us aren't feeling the benefits of Abenomics, so we thought that someone needs to take the initiative or things won't change. We're giving away tuna in the hope that we can be of some help. If I can't personally feel it, I hope at least the customers can feel the effects of Abenomics.
The impact on the economy as a whole is certainly being felt. In the first quarter of this year, it grew at 3.5%, fueled not just by a weakening yen, but also by an increase in domestic consumer demand. But the longer-term success of Shinzo Abe's gamble rests on a number of things: on rising consumer spending spreading beyond the wealthy to the rest of Japan, on business to start investing again and extending its capacity, and on his ability to push through structural reforms of how Japan's economy works. That's what Abe, who hosted his Indian opposite number this week, calls the third arrow in the quiver of Abenomics. The first and second, fiscal stimulus and monetary easing, having already been fired. He's due to unveil it in full next month, but there's scepticism that the restructuring, which includes promises to deregulate and get more women into the workforce, will be enough to cement the recent boom.
I think the whole concept of so-called Abenomics is really very much focused on creating a bubble economy so that deflation can be overcome. If you like, creating even more poisonous gases to get rid of the existing poisonous gases.
Much will depend on how industry responds. 80% of Hideaki Irisawa's business involves selling parts to some of Japan's industrial giants, among them Mitsubishi, Toyota and Honda. He senses those customers' renewed optimism, but says reality has yet to catch up to sentiment.
When it comes to our company and our sales, it's improving a little bit, but it's not enough to be able to call it real growth.
Irisawa's real passion isn't for car parts, it's for his company's own innovations. But he's not ready to invest in large-scale development and production just yet. For now, he's sitting out the initial boom to see what Abenomics can really deliver. Harry Fawcett for Counting the Cost, Al Jazeera, Tokyo.
So let's get the expert view on Abenomics. We welcome back to Counting the Cost Dr Seijiro Takeshita, who is Managing Director of Mizuho International. And Seijiro, before we get into the guts of what Abenomics is really all about, I think it's worth noting that at least Shinzo Abe is doing something. He's being aggressive, he's got clear policies, and there's really something to be said for that in these tough times.
Absolutely. I mean, that is perhaps the biggest difference from the previous government that we saw, which basically was doing absolutely nothing. And we were just sitting down and getting hit by the external factors. It's quite true that they became a lot more verbal. Whether it's achievable or not, they are giving some numerical targets, which shows the market their intent to do something about it, as you just said. And also, it was just announced that the government will come up with the basic framework policy of the further economic expansion to come, to be announced before the election in July. They'll be announcing sometime in mid-June. So we know that there's a consecutive series of announcements that would come basically to get the feel-good factor perpetuated.
Okay, so he's doing something, but we've got to look at specifically what he's doing. And one of the things that really sticks out, I mean, it's effectively money printing, isn't it? It's a type of thing that is actually going to add to the country's debt. So on the face of it, it doesn't actually seem like the best idea for Japan, with all the debt it already has.
Well, in the long run, definitely, it certainly is not a positive thing. But in the shorter to mid-run, basically they needed two things. One is, as we just talked, basically to give a message to the market that they would be trying to reflate the economy. And secondly, they also needed a carte blanche, in my opinion, to basically keep funding the JGB side to sustain their debt levels. So basically, they have basically achieved this in one go, at least for the moment. So yes, I agree with you in the long run, it still remains to be a big problem, but at least shorter to mid-run, they have basically given them some time to play with more time to rejuvenate the economy.
What do you think about the jobs aspect of Abenomics? I mean, any leader is going to want to create jobs for his or her people, but you'd have to say that unemployment is actually not a huge problem in Japan right now.
No, the unemployment rate is still very low in comparison to other nations, but let's not forget that Japan has an immense amount of rigidity in the employment side, especially on the re-employment side, because still many of especially the larger companies adhere to lifelong employment and seniority system, and therefore it is very, very dire conditions on a re-employment stages. So the fact of the matter is Japan is one country where you find suicide rate and jobless rates correlated. In other words, the spending of the Japanese gets only rejuvenated, in my opinion, if we see a stability in the employment side. So we do need to basically continuously work on this factor, basically to deregulate the market, but at the same time to make sure that the jobless rate doesn't increase substantially, because that would hinder private consumption as well, quite directly in Japan. As you know, the governments have been trying very hard to increase Japanese private consumption, throwing virtually cash in their faces. But as you know, what happened was that there were more savings rather than actually spending.
Okay, so jobs looking solid, wages in some cases going up, which we hope would equate to more spending somewhere down the track as well. Are these actually early signs that the policies are starting to work?
Well, so far, yes, it is. We are seeing signs of that. But what we really need to see after this massive easing policy and some fiscal policy, what we really need to see is a lot of deregulatory measures after the election on July the 21st, where LDP is expected to have a landslide victory. If they do, then they would have more autonomy over decision-making process. And we are hoping that they will come up with a structural transitional type of policies which would induce growth in Japan in the longer-term basis, not these wishy-washy short-termism kind of policies, but the long-term rejuvenation policies that would come through. Now, they will be very painful ones, and the LDP is historically very bad at coming up with, painful policies, because they always have a tendency to revert back to feeding the vested interest. But this time around, it's do or die, and this is one of the expectations, I think, in the market that's rising, that they will, I hope, would come up with more painful but policies that would have good multiplier to the economy.
We've talked mostly about internal, domestic stuff, Seijiro, so I wonder if we can widen out and put Japan into the regional context, competing with the South Koreas and the Taiwans of this world. Do you think they can foot it with them on this economic path?
Very much so. I think I'd like to point out two things. Firstly, the weakening of the yen that we're seeing is not only going to benefit them on the operating profit levels, but more so on the competitiveness, such as pricing. Japan has lost so much market share to the Germans, the Koreans, and many of the countries you just mentioned. But basically, there will be a clawback stages that would take place on back of this correction from this hyper yen. Secondly, I think what you will be seeing here is Japan continuously will be in coordination with many of the nations that you just mentioned, because many people do think that Japan is in competition with Southeast Asia, and that's partially true. But if you look at the level of Japan, the economy where it's at, it's a mature economy with over $50,000 in per capita income, per capita GDP. Basically, we're not in a competition mode necessarily. We're in a complementation mode with many of these nations. So to basically look at as a direct competition on Southeast Asian nation, I think is often misleading.
All right, then final thought then on the man himself. We talk about Abenomics, so we should probably talk about Shinzo Abe himself. Can I say he was a failure in his first term back in 2006? Maybe that's too tough, but at least he was, he was the first of many Japanese leaders who couldn't hold the position for too long. As we said at the start of this interview, though, he seems a lot more focused this time, a lot more aggressive. I
would like to think that he learned from his past mistake. And again, I think Japan is at a point of do or die. And this time around, we don't have room for making or reverting back to feeding vested interest or going back to the old methodology. Of course, there are many positive things in the Japanese governance style which should not be scrapped, which should not adhere to, for example, Anglo-American type right away. But at the same time, there needs to be a lot of corrections, introduction to be made. And this definitely is, I think, our last chance to do so. In the past 15 or 20 years, we've basically lost it, as you know. And I think Abe-san and many others, also that's in the Economic Forum, etc., knows that this is perhaps our last chance.
Dr. Seijiro Takeshita talking Abenomics with us. Always a pleasure, Seijiro. Thank you. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, building an economy under occupation. We see what's really happening on the ground in the Palestinian territories as the US presents its plan for prosperity. Now, something we didn't talk about so much in our discussion on Japan was its so-called lost decades, a time when its economy gradually, fell apart. Now, much has been offered in the way of reasons and solutions for it all, but there's a real possibility that the West is heading down that same path. Our next guest certainly subscribes to that theory, so much so, he wrote a book about it. When the Money Runs Out was described by the UK's Telegraph newspaper as, quote, the economic equivalent of post-apocalyptic fiction, charting the end of Western affluence, and gives the author of The Shining a run for his money when it comes to filling readers with dread. And he's actually a regular guest on Counting the Cost. Every year we sit down with HSBC's chief economist, Stephen King, to talk about the year gone by. This time he is Stephen King, the author, and not the one you're actually thinking of. Stephen, I'd like to start with, actually it's a bit of a shout out to your daughters, Helena, Olivia and Sophie. You said in the book, for my children's sake, I can only hope that the recommendations at the end of this book are heeded. That's some pretty serious talk, a whole generational thing.
No, that's absolutely right. The problem in one sense is that over the last few years, the baby boomers, and I'm at the very end really of that generation of baby boomers, have done very, very well. They've managed to grab lots and lots of resources, but at the same time have built up huge amounts of debt. But over the last 10 years or so, Western economies have mostly stalled. The UK, the US, Europe have delivered growth rates much, much lower than we've been seeing in the past. And the problem with those very low growth rates, of course, is that it means that all those debts we thought we could pay off as a consequence of continuous increases in income are much more difficult to deal with now.
The thing is, Stephen, during those good years that you described, there was stuff happening. Global trade was opening up and women were coming into the workforce and education opportunities were coming up as well. These were fundamental shifts in society that were driving growth. This was good news. Now, is the thing that we just don't have those things now, or we're just waiting for the next, bright fundamental idea to come along and kickstart things again?
Well, I would argue that in the 1950s, the Western world started off in a very difficult position, obviously after 2 world wars. And there were a series of events that helped to lift levels of economic activity extremely quickly. But these were, if you like, one-off events. So the comments you just made about the opening up of world trade, the emancipation of women in terms of the workforce, all those kinds of issues have been important in really leading to a kind of step leap in economic activity over the last 50 or 60 years. You can only really do it once, at least from the point of view of the Western world. Now, I think there's still a tremendous opportunity for world trade to open up further, but it's not so much trade within the so-called developed world area, nor is it trade between East and West, which already has developed quite a long way. It's rather trade on a South-South basis, so from Asia through to the Middle East, through to Sub-Saharan Africa, and then into Latin America. That's a tremendous opportunity for growth in the future, but it's not an opportunity that can be easily shared by North America or by, for example, Western Europe.
You keep talking about the West. I'm wondering, does it need to look elsewhere for lessons? I'm thinking of two countries in particular, Japan, which we've already talked about, and Argentina. Two countries which had their problems. The West looked at it and kind of said, oh, well, it won't happen to us, we'll be fine. And then it did happen to them. Do they need to learn some lessons from what happened there?
Well, there are. First of all, in Japan's case, despite all the discussions currently about Abenomics and huge stimulus in Japan, Japan does suffer from supply-side difficulties rather than demand-side difficulties. Things like offshoring and aging population, all these things have affected Japan and can't really be solved easily through a simple fiscal or monetary stimulus. And yes, that's precisely the argument we're having in the Western world today. We ignore all these longer-term factors and just assume with a wave of the monetary magic wand we can solve our difficulties. The other, I think, important issue here is that when you compare Japan with Argentina, both of which really disappointed in different parts of the 20th century, Argentina's disappointment starting much earlier than Japan's, there was a fundamental difference between the two. In Japan's case, although it stagnated, income inequality was very, very low, so you could genuinely say that everyone in Japan was like all in this together. Whereas in the case of Argentina, when its economy stagnated, there was already very, very high levels of income inequality. And that meant that reform designed to actually kickstart the economy was very, very difficult to do because no one trusted anyone else because there were winners and losers associated with reform. And when you look at the US or the UK today, the levels of income inequality that we see in both countries actually are almost as high, if not as high, as was the case in Argentina. So the issue there is not only do we have stagnation, but we're starting from a position whereby there are very big gaps in terms of levels of income across communities, which in turn make it more difficult to deliver reform because effectively no one trusts anybody else.
OK, Stephen, let's take the economist's hat off for a moment and put the author's hat on, because I am keen to get some thoughts from you on what it's actually, like writing this book, writing a book which is, if I'm honest, economically apocalyptic. What was it like?
Well, it's not that bad. I mean, I do have some suggestions at the end of the book as to how to try and deal with some of these difficulties. It's a great learning experience. You have to read a huge amount of academic papers and books and so on to effectively educate yourself. And in particular, I was very interested in some of the historical lessons which might play a role in where we are today. So I went as far back as the Peasants' Revolt in the UK in 1381, to the French Revolution, and so on and so forth, all as examples of where economic growth disappointed. And of course, when you're off work, you can spend more time with your family as well, which is also a real pleasure.
And has anyone come to you since the book's been written, anyone, policymakers or bankers or anyone up there, and sort of said to you, Stephen King, you're right here, we like what you're saying, and some of your ideas, we should actually look at even implementing them?
I think there's a great deal of sympathy for some of the issues contained within the book, particularly this idea that we're facing a lower growth rate, and we've made claims on future income that can't be met, and that somehow those claims have to be reduced. And I think the problem we have at the moment is that most politicians and policymakers, in public at least, if not in private, are still engaged in a dramatic degree of wishful thinking. They like to portray that they can easily generate a decent recovery. But I think in the back of their minds, they're very well aware that actually what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years has been actually quite disappointing. To be fair, the good news is that we did avoid a Great Depression, which was genuinely threatened back in 2008, 2009. But the problem is that the recovery that's come through subsequently is far weaker than any policymakers had suggested or indeed expected. And I don't think they've quite come to terms with the fact that income levels are so much lower than was originally thought.
Stephen King, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and good luck with the book when the money runs out. Let's look at India now, where more than 3 million people have fallen victim to an investment scam, one that's fleeced some of the poorest people of $5.5 billion in savings. And lives have been lost too. 18 people, including depositors and agents, have now committed suicide. Divya Gopalan has the story now from Kolkata.
The papers stack up. Thousands arrive every day. They invested to multiply their savings. Instead, they've lost everything. This is the office of the Inquiry Commission, set up by the government to help those who've been duped by investment scams.
We were made to believe the more you put in, the more the returns. We thought there would be no problem as the ministers were involved.
While looking for work as a maid, Mamta was recruited as one of 300,000 agents for the Sarda Group, a Ponzi scheme which has defrauded hundreds of thousands in West Bengal.
Now those investors are after us, demanding their money back. They don't care where we get it from.
More than a dozen small investors have already taken their lives after Sarda went bust. The head of the conglomerate, Sudipta Sen, has been arrested. Over 5 years, the group managed to rake in $500 million from mostly poor villagers.
The main thing is not only shutting down funds. The main thing is how to reimburse gullible investors, poor people who without knowing were persuaded to put their money in them. A mechanism has to be found.
The government proposed raising taxes to drum up compensation funds. The chief minister was even quoted as saying, "Smoke a little more to help investors."
The Securities and Exchange Board of India say people have handed over about $2 billion to these so-called collective investment schemes. But they also point out, as most of these funds are unregulated, the money raised could be much higher than estimated.
For most investors, the only recourse is government compensation.
The problem is, when the government promises this kind of help, this is like providing insurance to these chit funds or these Ponzi scheme players, The government will come and protect the people who've been cheated.
With no solution in sight, the state government and regulators are now passing the buck, blaming each other for allowing the money-spinning schemes to flourish.
Finally this week, the occupied West Bank, the key word there being occupied. Now, Palestinians say it's the Israeli constraints on their economy which are the major issue. They need to be lifted for life to become something like business as usual. But the current thinking, at least from the United States, is a cash injection. Jane Ferguson reports from the occupied West Bank.
These quarries have been a vital local industry in the occupied West Bank for years. Ahmed Thawabte's family have been cutting stone here for 5 generations. But running a business under occupation is an incredible challenge.
We work in our own land as if we were thieves, not owners, because the Israelis confiscate our equipment. They say you don't have permits. Okay, give us permits. They're not giving us any.
The potential for bigger production is huge.
Quarrying here employs around 4,000 people. But bosses say that if Israelis would grant more licenses to dig, then they could potentially employ tens of thousands of Palestinians, putting a huge dent in unemployment in the West Bank.
20% of people here are jobless. The US Secretary of State says a plan to invest $4 billion as part of a peace deal could change that. But experts say cash before political changes won't work.
If you are speaking about real economy, you are speaking about sovereignty. So the politics will come again quickly. What you can do through throwing some money in the country is that you are only managing the conflict. You are not resolving the conflict.
Israeli controls over every sector of the economy in the West Bank have been a problem for years, one which American mediators have failed to solve so far.
People from the US consulate came several times to see the situation. They promised to help us work here. More than 10 years have passed like that. Nothing's changed.
Change is what people here need most. But after 4 years of stalemate between both sides, those like Ahmed are not convinced it will come soon.
And that's our show for this week, but there is more for you online at aljazeera.com/business, the latest business headlines, plus all our previous episodes for you to catch up on. And then to get in touch, you can tweet either me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or just drop us an email at countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.